All right. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this session entitled Illustration and Narrative Complexity in Visual Stories, an interview with Chad Lewis, illustrator. We're really happy that you could be with us for this one as well. We have a lot of awesome things in our program for this festival. And this is the 4th annual SummerFest. And it's, of course, hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. I am Jessi Lewis. I'm a 1455 board member, a writer, essayist, poet, educator, and I'm always really excited to talk to the different creatives that come on here. In this case, we have Chad Lewis. Chad is an assistant professor in visual communication and design at Kent State University. He has worked with a variety of clients and publications, including Marvel, Boom Studios, Adobe, Hakai Magazine, Skyhorse Publishing, Myths and Legends Podcast, Astonishing Legends Podcast, and Bold Rock Cider. He has had numerous publications, but just to zoom in on a few, he's worked specifically with the Planet of the Apes franchise, the comic Kong, Gods of Skull Island, and editorial work for Hakai Magazine, and 1455's own Movable Type for the cover illustrations. So this is really exciting for us. Chad, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's awesome. I get to talk to Chad all the time about art, and I was really excited to have him come in now that he's doing stuff for Movable Type. If you haven't checked out Movable Type yet, it's really exciting as a publication through 1455. And the issue that we really want to talk about today, that we'll talk about, I believe, 2 of them. The one we'll focus on first is issue 11, which was, was themed around state of the art. And so this issue is all about artists and understanding their modern world at the moment. I love how Chad has presented this. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share so we can all check it out and see it at once together, which is always a really magical part of our tech. All right, Chad, can you see that?
I got you. Yeah, I can see it.
Cool. Okay, beautiful. All right, so this is the cover for issue 11, Chad's artwork, which when I saw this thing, it just blew me away, mainly because I got it right away, which I think sometimes that's not as easy of a translation for people. So that's why I was so excited to see it, among other things. But let's talk about this thing. So I want to talk about that awesome dividing line right in between. It's like 2 worlds there, which is really fantastic. We have the artist's hand reaching up to street level. So why did you choose the street? There are so many images that could go here, but why this specific one?
First of all, thank you for all the kind words. It's always a joy to get to talk to you guys, and specifically working with y'all on 1455, the movable type stuff is a dream come true. The amount of fun prompts like state of art is just, it's great. It's so much fun. So with this one, trying to tackle state of art is it's a term. I'm an educator, as you mentioned, and I have students who are leaving this. The seniors I'm working with are academic and learning the skills, and then they translate from this kind of vacuum of making the best possible piece to out in the world, out in among other people. And until you gain your footing, it really is a bit of feels like you're reaching up, trying to grab somebody. So with this piece in the street and kind of this workspace that is less than, I don't want to say less than ideal, because it is ideal to have a good creative mess, but kind of the whitewash hustle and bustle of walking people versus this space that feels familiar and messy, is kind of what I was trying to convey. That not so much for the artist that has an established client list or somebody who kind of has this comfortability, but more this person that's trying to find their voice. That's kind of what I was trying to convey here.
That makes perfect sense. I think he has my chair that I'm sitting in right now, actually.
That's the ubiquitous chair. Yeah.
That's it. And I love the proportion too, because the feet, it's, we don't see above their knees. In fact, we're not even quite at their knees, which I think is really important, right? Because it keeps us down low, which really helps. But why did you choose? We have essentially a green palette below and kind of a reddish orange up top. So why did you do opposing colors like this?
So I have never had an aha moment with colors. And I've always loved anatomy and composition. Colors for me have always been kind of a okay, what happens next? How do I solve this? And then I was introduced to color schemes. This sounds this sounds like I should know better, but it's the truth. Color schemes for me were revelatory in that you can convey mood through, especially complementary colors are super helpful as beginning palettes, because complementary colors are opposite each other on the color wheel. And when you put them side by side, they do a lot of talking. They have a lot of what would you call it, chemistry between each other. So this red-green palette is a palette that's essentially, I've kind of skewed it here and there, but essentially red next to green. If we think of red next to green, we think of Christmas, right? If we think of other complementary colors, we think of, blue is a cross on the wheel from orange. My high school, that was our high school colors, because those colors have a lot to say. Similarly, yellow and purple. All of these mixes, when applied correctly, create a really great dialogue. And that's essentially all I'm hoping to achieve with colors, is a dialogue for the eye to kind of understand a push and a pull that, that you're trying to convey.
That makes perfect sense too. I mean,
Yeah.
and I like that too. I mean, if you're talking about opposing and you want to view that as a metaphor, then the guy below reaching up to the street is the opposing, right? So it's, or rather they're opposing him. So it makes perfect sense as a presentation of the conflict at hand. So that makes sense.
It helps that we have a swampy green underwater versus a not a calculating gold, but a a sparser color scheme up top.
Right. And it doesn't look like Christmas. I mean, it's the same concept.
Thank you.
Don't want it. But it's not, I mean, it isn't that stark red and green that we associate with that holiday. And it's also not a single, I guess, single color form. So like there's different greens below.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what you have to do. They're finding different chromas, hues, and saturations as you're scaling to keep it away from feeling one note.
Thank you. There's that artist vocabulary.
That's that academia.
All right. So that's awesome. I'm really glad that we got to kind of introduce this through Movable Type. And I think that's a really great direction for Movable Type to present itself with. So that's a awesome way to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the topic of this takes us in such an important direction, state of the art. You mentioned that and how you have to talk to your seniors about it. And it's something that as a writer, I have to think about this a lot too. I'll get a student every once in a while who asks me if they should get their MFA, and I always have to think about it for a while of how to approach it, because it is tricky. So for you, this is definitely the struggle image here. When you think of the artist's greater struggle, what is it that you feel is the most important thing to be aware of in our environment? We've got changes on the horizon for artists in terms of education and economics. There's so much going on in this. So what do you think artists should be aware of?
Great question. So it's never been easy to be an illustrator. There was the golden age of illustration before photography became the predominant way of storytelling. But right now, there's definitely an avenue for illustrators to make their mark on the world. And, if you're okay with a side job for a while, building a client list and kind of working, the main obstacle I see is there's a term, collapse of context. Okay, collapse of context is essentially death of the artist. It's the thing that you're making. It might hold meaning to other people, and when I think of death of the artist, sometimes I think of it as a positive thing. The art speaks after the artist. It's the thing that you made. When I think of collapse of context, I think of it as a negative thing, a negative aspect of creating in a social media driven atmosphere, because the way to get work is through putting your work out there on, click-based software that people are scrolling through. So, style is a dirty word when you're trying to teach people fundamentals of illustration. When you translate that to Twitter or Instagram, if you're moving through these media platforms as a student, as somebody who's trying to get into this, it feels like a competition of style. The dressing on the end of it is why people, press likes or don't. And for the the emerging artists, those likes, it is painful to see how much that matters to people who are, getting into the world. There is a beautiful, a wonderful artist who does beautiful comic work. His name is James Heron, and he has, a wonderful social media presence where he puts his work in progress, and every once in a while there'll be a piece that takes off with 30,000 likes. Okay, just top of comic industry. And so I always would save his work and put it in a folder and look at all this stuff and process. It's solid gold for anybody who's trying to figure out, work in progress, especially, is really valuable for social media. And then one day he put a post up, so just so everybody knows, I'm paraphrasing badly, I don't have it in front of me, but essentially, just so everybody knows, getting a lot of likes on an image does not give you health insurance. At a certain point, this mode of communication is a fallacy. It's a paper tiger. So that's the biggest hurdle, I think, for students getting into the world right now is, developing and understanding how to put your work out there and not letting it dictate your creative life. If you have a piece that you are in process on and you have shaky feet about proceeding with it, and then you put it into social media, I hate to say it, but a lot of my students will continue with something if they get a great response from people they don't know, or they will stop it if they don't. And what kind of a sounding board is that? It's unfair. It's a little bit cold and calculating, and I hate to see that for anybody who is trying to find a voice. Does that make sense?
That sounds like something that a lot of creatives can hear and kind of move off of.
Yeah.
Not just illustration, which is why I think I like talking to you about this kind of thing, because I always think of heard Alexander Chi speak once, and he's a fantastic writer, and he was at a big conference, and he said that young writers always need to take care of their teeth and their feet. Because it's the thing that if you mess it up early on, then you can't take care of it later, and you can't expect good health insurance to care for that later as a writer, which is like the harshest thing to hear, but also like the most realistic. And I always think about that. Then I always think he always said that he did 3 novels and before he actually got one published. And I thought that was wild, that was, right. And he's, at the time, I don't believe he was well known on social media. Now he's quite well known. And he didn't get, he talked about how the first 2 were just movements towards the 3rd one. And at the time I was like, that's wild. I'm going to get the first one. And now I'm on my 3rd. So it seems like, it's interesting because that social media area of our lives is also a fantastic way to hear from those people. Right.
For sure.
So it's an interest. It's definitely a kind of a vicious cycle, but
yeah, it's interesting because woe is me with illustration and getting started and stuff. With illustration, there is an immediacy to people who understand it or they don't. They respond to it or they don't. And so my industry is blessed in that regard. Whereas writing, there is a little bit of work on the back end. You've written a thing, and then you have to get in front of people who take the time to read it. And I always, when I think about illustration, I go, whoa, we've got it pretty good as far as getting ourselves out there. Well, it's an immediate reaction.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, there's some scenarios where that's not necessarily true. Poets have found recently that posting their actual poem in an image format on Instagram or on Twitter can get more activity and more notice than if they get it published in a small journal. And this is a specific group of people, not all poets can go about this. And so sometimes that works for them in different ways than the traditional publishing, but it is also not necessarily following the academic route, and that confuses that identity. And there's a whole, poetry is its own world because of this, because you tend to not have any chance of surviving on your poetry. Right. So, that's different. But yeah, I mean, I think at a certain point it becomes collaborative with the people who are reading it and then sending it out and then influencing you. So that's also different.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just that offshoot of illustration is an image that you take in whether you want to or not.
Oh yeah, well that's true. But you do have
Yeah.
people who are demanding of your image, right? So you'll have requests for changes and all of that.
All the time. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, all the time.
Like the
Yeah.
like,
I had
no.
I had just read a thing that was terrifying. That was in the next 15 years, there'll be AI that can do beautiful illustration work that from the ground up can create work. So there's this kind of dawning awareness that as we increase our capabilities technology wise, there will be a replacement to the image that you see in front of you, essentially, if people are interested in doing it. So the importance, in my mind, translates to from this pure focus on form to the message that's behind it, to
Right.
the to your creative voice. In some ways it's a little bit liberating, as the hand done illustration gets a little bit more niche. The value of having a voice is raised, and I find that really fascinating as far as this unknown territory ahead of us. Curious
Right.
curious and terrified to see how that plays out. So
The question is, can AI build a metaphor successfully?
in probably another 10-15 years.
Or even next year, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think that's the real thing. We have some AI stuff that pops up, and it is kind of terrifying, but it's also used as like a moment of hilarity when it doesn't quite work. So it's always tricky. But I
Yeah.
would think that would be a really easy thing for AI to kind of mimic and fake an image, but the depth, I would have a hard. I don't know. That's my assumption, but I don't
Yeah,
know
I think
anything about
I
AI.
think we're still a ways off, thankfully. So
That's good. Okay,
yeah.
so let's keep going with this. We're on this image here. I don't want us to forget that we're looking at Chad's work today. Um,
Yeah.
but I want us to kind of shift this. Now, this conversation is all about narrative and illustration. So I do want us to think about that. So when you think about traditional stories, what I'm most accustomed to discussing, it has actually very similar discussion points. With illustration, whenever I use those same discussion points, it's almost just more literal because it's right in front of you and laid out. So in other words, we have a really common vocabulary in how we discuss narrative. So how do you think about movement and action as a way to keep tension present in a work? I mean, this has quite a bit of movement to it. So how do you utilize that?
Yeah, well, there are some similarities for sure. I think I always equate when I'm trying to convey storytelling to students, my Rosetta Stone is cinema, is movie making, and I'm starting to realize as I do that I need to update my go-to movies that I talk about to my students. But using that as kind of a great equalizer, storytelling is a great way to I don't know, sync up everybody's differing views of what's important in visual storytelling. For me, the most important thing is often overlooked, and it's your library, your frame, and your basic composition. I think all phones have it now, but there is in the camera app you can download a rule of thirds. It's a little graph that makes 9 similar size boxes or identical boxes along your live area. And that is used at the intersection of those boxes where they meet. That is used to tell you where kind of placeholders where the eye naturally goes throughout an image. And if as a creator, if you're trying to have a starting point, a rule of thirds is a great place to start to think about movement. Do you mind moving to the next slide so we could chat about? Yeah. So I've drawn a little field with little trees and little mountains. Okay. This is a really simple little sketch of just a field. There are a lot of ways to show this. Okay, those dividing that image really roughly into rule of thirds. And I look at it, I see some rectangles aren't exactly the same, but just so we get a general idea of what I'm talking about, dividing that into spaces, you start to understand where along this live area is important to storytelling. Okay, even to the point of how you place this simple image. If that field were to be 50-50 across that image where you would have even trees and even field, things start to feel really iconic in a quick read. What I talk about a quick read is that your eye is not allowed or encouraged to bounce around your composition. Okay, when I the first cover image that I was talking about, I did everything I could think of to keep that eye bouncing like a pinball in a pinball game. And so as you're trying to tell this visual story, using this rule of thirds is a great place to start as you're trying to build your image. For this one, I wanted to give an example of that with a little hiker. Do you mind scrolling down? Yeah, so here's our little hiker, okay? Our little hiker is on the left side of the image, lined up with that vertical left mark. That is the kind of agreed upon location for if you're going to put it doesn't have to be a full figure, if you're going to put an element that is important. A vertical or a horizontal there is a really great place to do it, okay? When we put this character here, if we look at this visual, the character is the first thing we see, and then our eye travels to, we start on the left of the image usually, and then we travel across this live area, okay? As we're traveling across this live area, we understand that there's nothing there. So that character on the left side is really important to tell you a journey that has not happened yet, that is starting, okay? If we go down one more, however, this is a character who has passed the journey. They've traveled that space. And it's really interesting when you look at this, how important that placement is. We spend so much time, I know I did, and I know working with students, they still spend so much time thinking about character design, perspective, color, value, all of those things. And sometimes I think this gets lost. And one of the first things you should figure out is, what does my live area have to say? What am I trying to convey to the viewer by simple placement? Okay, this person, if you are a comic artist, this is essential knowledge, because you don't want to place images on a panel where the narrative is already passed. Having kind of this idea of true storytelling and how to portray to the eye what you're trying to tell is really important. Let's scroll down to the last image right here. Yeah, so this character is dead set in the middle. It's not on the left vertices or the right vertices, it's right in the center. And I for a while, I was afraid to do this. I would always have my character off center. But when there's a character dead center, this story is about that character. It's not the space they've traveled on the left. It's not the space they've traveled on the right. It's this timeless quality to the character. And when you look at it, it starts to feel like you're more aware of his posture. Is he worn out? Is he contemplative? Is he walking? So although those rule of thirds are really important for placing information, it's also important to think of them as negative space where something couldn't exist. There's no one right answer, as long as you're aware of the power of placement in your space. Yeah, and that's one of the first things I like to convey to students is kind of, what are you thinking about in your live area? What are you trying to talk about?
Right. I like the concept of proportion to it. There's a author, I'm hoping I'm saying her name right, Margot Livesey, and she did a whole book about the writing process, and she takes her drafts and she highlights description, action, like scene work, dialogue, and then she zooms out and looks at the proportion.
Oh, that's amazing.
Make sure that it's never heavy in one area.
Yeah, I think you chatted with him, but David Wilson is a coworker and a friend of mine, and he's a really talented comic artist. And for his thesis, he built a kind of a visual way of looking at stories to see how they're balanced from a graphic design perspective. He was explaining it to me, and it is, in my mind, rocket science and Latin all rolled up into one. But there's a real value to understanding the weight of your image, the written image as well, understanding the symmetry to it.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like this. Also, I like that you now have a Pixar character that you can work with.
Yeah. Okay. And then the next thing I wanted to chat about is value.
Can I go scroll down?
Yeah, yes, please. It is less of a sexy subject matter. It's more of a placeholder for when we think of it, we think of black and white photography. We think of necessary information, but it's really one of the most important ways to, before you get into color, is one of the important ways to tell a story. If you put a ton of detail into those trees, we know that the tree on the far left is an elm tree by its leaves. We know that it is fall and that these trees are blank, 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 blank. I could continue with non-essential information for storytelling, but what we put all that information in, and we lose the crux of what's this image about? What is the storytelling happening? It's really easy to lose momentum. And a way to fix that is to think about the most important part of your image should be the largest value contrast, with lots of exceptions. But as a rule of thumb, if you're looking at an image that you like, if you have an illustrator that you like and your eye is being, you can see, hey, this illustrator wants me to look here. There's an important message that's here. A lot of that will be done with a value change, which is a really great way to read imagery well, to kind of understand how to tell a story. Let's scroll down to the next one. It's the same image, but it's a different value scheme, and seeing how these value changes tell a different story. There's no one right answer as long as you have contrast, but it's a really fascinating way to break down, just variation and be able to sync up your story with your particular viewpoint, which is really, really tricky to do, for sure.
It's interesting. I'm going to scroll back and forth really quickly so we can do a quick comparison. That second one is way more foreboding.
It's interesting, right? Yeah, while I was sketching this, I kept thinking, man, his posture every once in a while looks so down and out. And I don't know, it's just a value change, but the mood does really shift by value, for sure.
Interesting. Okay. It's funny too, because it reminds me, and I will not go into it, but this reminds me of punctuation in poetry, but that is another
that's actually probably pretty similar.
Yeah, it really is. My students have a really hard time with poetry, and I always say that you have to look for the place where the poet is waving a flag, like trying to get their attention to something.
That's amazing.
So that's what it feels like. It's like you just need to listen to the creator here.
Yeah, for sure.
May I scroll down? Because I already
Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is our other movable type. I'm gonna zoom out just a touch.
It'll work fine like this. Work fine for what we need. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. This so I make sure I can get everything. Mainly because I just want that tail in there because it's the best. Okay, so this was another 1455 cover, and I can't remember. Do you remember the theme of this one?
It's called storytelling.
Storytelling. Okay.
Was the brief? Yeah. And I settled on birds because I like drawing a murder of crows is really fun. The reason I bring this up is because I talk about rule of thirds and the necessity of that and all this stuff. That is a great rule if you're excited about that rule. If you're not excited about it, you don't have to adhere to it. I have a wonderful professor and now coworker, Professor Doug Goldsmith, who is just, if anybody's up in Kent State and wants to take a life-changing character design class, hop on over to his character design. But he was less worried about strict adherence to rule of thirds and more to diagonal lines, and using diagonal lines to tell a story and direct the eye. And once you start thinking about it, as far as the form that I'm building is an arrow pointing to something important in my live area, it becomes a puzzle that you want to solve. Less about this infrastructure that's a safe space that I can fall back to if I'm not sure, and more of how can I direct the eye. It's one is a armor and the other is a challenge. This way, and as a whole, I don't like this illustration as much, but I will say it was much more of a sweaty, exciting process to make it, because I was trying to solve a question on my end, which is super exciting. Let's scroll down to the next image. So if we think of diagonal lines, they're the way to move the eye. They're the way. I was talking earlier about a pinball in a pinball machine bouncing around. That's what this is. If you can do it well, vertical lines and horizontal lines allow for the eye to rest, allow for direct lines of communication, start to feel textual and information driven. Diagonal lines, however, are movement and chaos and lots of energy. And for a piece where I was trying to convey how could a bunch of birds work together to unlock a door, trying to tell that through diagonal lines and that hectic quality, that's why I tackled it the opposite of how I tackled the earlier piece, reaching to the street. There's less organization here that's obvious, more frenetic energy, but you can see the most important elements in my mind for this were the key and the keyhole, and then the birds where their feet are attached, so you can tell they're kind of anchored to this space. Okay, and trying to have our faces and the bodies pointing towards those elements,
Right.
which is a delicate dance. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you lose the horizon line, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Right. Which is, I mean, in some ways, that is the frenetic part, not having the horizon line.
Yeah, this is definitely a zoomed in image. And there are, again, it's a working process as you're solving it. But the only reason I bring this up is because there's no one way there's no golden rule to solve all of your issues. And you should, as an illustrator, I would always recommend being malleable and asking different challenges of yourself, essentially. Right.
Yeah, that's really awesome. It's really nice to have that in relation to the other one as well, the other cover, because that's a nice way to compare.
Yeah, let's scroll down. I wanted to show you the infrastructure I used for this. So this is strictly rule of thirds. You can see the important elements are kind of along those vertices, and I did have a central character, but tried to make sure that the vertical line of the chair fit on the left side, the lamp touched that live area, all those things kind of lined up, as you can see. And then on top of that, let's scroll down to the last slide. I like to mess with the golden rule or golden ratio or golden spiral. If you look at if anybody's interested, the golden spiral is a mathematical solution to, I'm going to butcher this. It is, I'm not going to reel off the numbers to you now, but you can find it it's naturally occurring in nature. If you look at a seashell, the ratio at which things terminate as they scale down, this is kind of a derivation of that that's been translated to graphic work. And it's really helpful if you place it over an image. It's kind of lines up with your rule of thirds, and it also kind of imbues this strong diagonal line that you're trying to solve for, trying to keep active in your live area, so that you can have focal points and also some variation. And you can see this is just kind of a rough overlay, where that lamp that felt like it was in there, as a second thought, or is really important in my mind for leading your eye up out of that ocean of green into the red and the orange, if that makes sense, using that diagonal line along with that spiral, and also making use of that notebook sticking out of the water, why it's pretty far up that live area, because it falls into that location of where that golden ratio, the most important area that's terminating to, if that makes sense to you. I think I'm falling into the weeds here, and I don't intend
to. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's essentially giving more focal points in what's already established as classic focal points.
It's like a hierarchy of focal points, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I really like that, actually, if you look at it long enough. That's awesome. No, that's really cool. I like that a lot. In terms of our mathematical leanings, just our instinct to go in that direction, that is almost creepy, because it works so well, but you wouldn't know it was there at all.
Yeah, it's interesting, because when I came into visual communication design as a graduate student, there was within the graphic design, the rule of thirds and golden ratio, that plays an important part in important textual information. If you look at websites, a lot of them fall into rule of thirds, because at those 4 points, there should be important content. I get to skate around in the illustration realm, which is, let's tell a fun story. Let's use our imagination. But this stuff also has, is important for telling effective, conveying effective information. It serves multiple purposes, which is really fascinating.
Well, that's awesome. Well, we've had a nice in-depth conversation, and I'm really staring at this image for a while, so I think I'm no longer doing this as well as I could be. But I mean, that's really cool, and I'm glad that this is something that lots of artists can be driven towards and understanding. I mean, I think this image alone is something that people could use as inspiration for a short story, to be honest. Like, there's a lot that's going on here that is something to think about, and it's and then you toss in your design map here, and it just makes so much sense. So that's really cool. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Chad, for stopping by for 1455 and talking to us about this, because this is awesome for our festival. I'm really excited.
it's always great to chat with y'all, and you guys are doing great work on your end. So
Thank you. Well, it is awesome to have some kind of a narrative that comes in and to feel like you're not just connecting with a different form of art than what our typical writer is looking at or our typical artist is looking at, but to also like connect with what people look for in general, and that's what's really important.
yeah.
So anyway, this is great. Thank you so much, and thank you to the people watching for joining us for Illustration and Narrative Complexity in Visual Stories, an interview with Chad Lewis, illustrator. We're so pleased that Chad was here. Thank you, Chad, again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was great to have you. And we hope this discussion has been valuable. Please be sure to check out 1455 Literary Arts online at 1455litarts.org, because we do conversations like this throughout the year. And of course, we have more programming through the festival. So thanks again, Chad. Good luck with all your stuff.
Thank you very much.